Hi, I'm Max Keiser.
I'm Stacy Herbert.
This is the Keiser Report. Gold saluting the world economy breakdown. Stacy, tell us more.
Max, that's our first headline there. Gold gives a standing ovation for the Obama-Boehner masterpiece of political theater. So we've seen in America the political kabuki theater getting crazier and crazier, but this is the important thing is that how gold responded. And obviously always a deal is going to be done, right? We knew that. But we have always told everybody that gold is responding to this collapse in American empire.
Yes, it is responding. It's responding to the collapse in fiat money. It's responding to the collapse in the American empire. Exactly. They had a great run after World War II, but now it's run its course, and now it's all falling apart, and all the satellites that relied on the U.S. for their largesse, all those military contractors and client states and puppet states that got all that free money from a corrupt kleptocracy in America, they're all being choked. And anyone with real money is buying gold and silver. The price keeps going higher, and this will continue because no amount of growth will support this amount of debt. It's impossible. It's mathematically impossible. There's 500 trillion in debt out there. Unless there's 10 planets worth of earthlings slaving away 24/7, they'll never be paid back.
And the other important thing to note here, Max, is I really believe that this political theater is at this point the only thing keeping the US dollar afloat. It used to be backed by gold, and then it was backed by oil, and I guess the industry and productivity of Americans. Now all those other things are gone, right? And all you have is this political theater to make people think that there's actually something there.
Well, they're stalling because they're hoping that at some point growth kicks in. But you hit peak saturation of debt in 2007. And no amount of accounting fraud or trickery or Bernie Madoff-like Ponzi scheming can now rejigger the books so that you've got any amount of growth to satisfy this amount of debt. So you're talking about debt collapse all over the world. It's a global debt collapse. That's what we're talking about.
But speaking of wacko, insane, political actors, political leaders, analysis in debt row, hints of emerging economy crises. So here's Reuters. They look at the U.S. and this silly brinksmanship and the crazy fighting that goes on over nothing. Debt default, a ratings downgrade, political deadlock. Such terms once associated primarily with the developing world now abound in the mighty United States. Now, I would say it was the once mighty United States. And they interview a foreign policy expert who says, we attend a lot of meetings with Latin Americans, and we used to complain to them about the problems they had, and now they like to say to us, that sounds just like the U.S.
Right. Well, look at countries like Brazil, for example. They got out from underneath the IMF oppression, economic oppression, and now the economy is doing great. But the U.S., how are they going to escape financial oppression from the banking terrorists? How are they going to escape the likes of a Lloyd Blankfein or a Jamie Dimon? How are they going to get out from underneath that?
Well, the other thing that you saw with these military dictatorships throughout Latin America, the banana republics, is the reason why there were banana republics is the Chiquita Banana Company, right? They were actually corporate occupied. None of the countries of Latin America had anything to do with running their country for real, which left them just with play acting, like a crazy prince, where the real country and all the economy and all the wealth was taken by Chiquita and other corporations like Coca-Cola. So there was nothing there but for them to pretend that they were ruling the country, and they acted very crazy.
Yeah, the United Fruit, I believe, was what originally when they moved in and they occupied those Central American and Latin American countries, and they got such a brand exposure to such toxic militarization of those economies and the slaughter of folks and killing of union members that they had to rebrand as Chiquita. We're Chiquita. We kill less union organizers. I'm a Chiquita banana, and I'm here to say union organization is going to be slaughtered.
Well, let's look at these videos to see what America might look like the next time the deficit ceiling is hit. Here's India's parliament. You see a nice brawl there. Let's turn to the Punjab parliament. And then just for a little diversity here, Max, we're going to turn to Afghanistan. And here's two women busting it out in the floor of the Afghani parliament. So I think this is the next step.
Yeah, Tea Party female mud wrestling with Michelle Bachmann and that other chick's, what's her name with the glasses?
Michelle Bachmann and Sarah Palin.
Yeah, get those two in the mud wrestling for votes. I'd vote for that.
Okay, let's move on to some serious stuff here. Let's talk about what is going on for the banana republicanization of America. And the biggest corporate occupier is the banks.
Oh my God.
And this is our headline here, Max. The Fed audit. So this is from Senator Bernie Sanders' website. He was responsible for inserting into the Wall Street Reform Bill last year a clause which demanded a one-time audit of the Fed. And that is out. And what they've discovered is that the Federal Reserve lent out in emergency programs a total of $16 trillion to U.S. banks, foreign banks, and corporations like GE. And according to the report, however, there are two very important points here. The Fed provided conflict of interest waivers to employees and private contractors so they could keep investments in the financial firms that they were bailing out. They mentioned Jamie Dimon as benefiting from this clause, that he sat on the board of the New York Fed and bailed out JP Morgan. And then the investigation also revealed that the Fed outsourced most of its emergency lending programs to private contractors, many of which also were recipients of extremely low interest and then secret loans.
What, was Jamie Dimon dropped on his head as a kid or what? I mean, here's a guy who's given billions of dollars, total exemption from accountability, and then when he loses that, they give him a few more $billions. I mean, he makes a few bucks, okay, that's true, but compared to like a real player out there, somebody like an oligarch in one of these other countries, he's a pisher.
Yeah,
so how did this happen? The guy must be like, you know...
You're buying his presentation. This is, remember, it's Theater Max. And the theater, he's claiming to only make a few billion a year. And he's just a poor schmuck who doesn't know what he's doing. He's trying his hardest. But in fact, these guys own everything. They've taken control of everything. He could be worth $5 trillion. Who knows? Because it's a black hole of non-accountability. JP Morgan is the biggest Fed bank, and they're pretending they've outsourced it. The Fed is JP Morgan, so they're pretending like, oh, we outsourced these emergency lending programs to JP Morgan. And they're having to say they outsourced it to JP Morgan to hide the fact that the Fed is JP Morgan.
Okay, so Bernie Sanders got one-time audit, that's it?
Yes.
And there's no more audit coming?
There's no more audit coming.
And in that one-time audit, we discovered that there's massive fraud on Wall Street. Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan, the whole group, massive fraud.
Yes.
Okay, what's next?
Continuing on this theme of profits, you brought up corporate profits, a boom in corporate profits, a bust in jobs, wages. So now that we're officially 18 months out of recession, try to tell that.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, this is a banana republic, and this is something like Papa Doc would have told us, or Gaddafi. You know, these are the same sort of statements they would make. Yeah, we're out of recession. Anyway, of the alleged growth that has happened, only 1% of it has gone to wages and salaries. Only 1% of that growth. It's been 15%, 50%, and 25% in the previous 3 recessions. By contrast, corporate profits accounted for 88% of the growth. So this is clear banana republicanism.
Yeah, and that 1% that trickled down went to prison guards. And the corporate profits, of course, they are staying within the corporate sphere, if you will, because that 1-2% of the top elite have engineered essentially a sluiceway directly from the Fed and Wall Street into their pocket, bypassing the general population. And again, you have this bifurcation of society, this class war developing. And the beautiful part about it is that people in America are so drugged up on Thorazine and other antipsychotic drugs that they don't even notice.
Now, they also mentioned in this article that corporations have $1.9 trillion in cash, but are reluctant to spend it. And they speak to the Caterpillar CEO, Doug Oberhelman, and he said the reason they're not spending it is lack of clarity on U.S. deficit reduction plan, trade policy, regulation, much needed tax reform, blah, blah, blah. But the important thing here, he says, the absence of a long-term plan to improve the country's deteriorating infrastructure does not create an environment that provides our customers with confidence to invest. So here's the CEO of Caterpillar, who is these are one of the guys involved with the Business Roundtable, involved with the American Chamber of Commerce, that lobby to make sure that people are so stupid that they associate any sort of plan or action on behalf of the citizen, that's Marxist and socialism. So here they've created this environment where you have dilapidated, like bombed out infrastructure that looks worse than any, like Morocco or any North African country. It looks worse than that.
Yeah, plus they've got a lot of those Caterpillar tractors in places like Palestine running over folks like Rachel Corrie. So that's deflecting their attention from doing anything positive for their own country as well.
Yeah, but let's talk about the U.S. here, because this is what we're talking about. The important thing is the U.S. is collapsing, and there are a lot of political things they do all over the world. But the fact is, America itself is looking like a big, giant ghetto. And wherever you go.
Well, the ghettofication of America, whether it's Palestine or ghetto, Chicago, Detroit, Palestine, it's the same group of corporations. Caterpillar is enabling ghettofication in Palestine, same thing in Detroit, because you got a minority of CEOs who take all that money from the government, put it in their pockets, and they claim that, well, there's not enough infrastructure there to spread it around amongst the population because they're responsible for building the infrastructure, and they're not building the infrastructure because they're pocketing the money themselves. How can that be possibly construed as a representative democracy when you've got insiders and CEOs stealing money wholesale and then claiming that they can't possibly distribute it because they don't have the money to do so because they stole the money?
And finally, Max, for the entire picture of a banana republic, so they've been fighting over this deficit, right? 11 stunning facts about America's prisons. Prisons cost America $600 billion per year. To compare that to Medicare is $452 billion per year. Medicaid, which is medical care for poor people, that's less than $275 billion. So U.S. prisons cost $600 billion to the taxpayer. Between 1987 and 2007, the national prison population tripled. 734 out of every 100,000 Americans are behind bars in the U.S., far and away the highest number in the world. And typically, parole programs cost taxpayers $7.47 per day per parolee, while prisons cost $78.95 per day per inmate nationwide, which is more than the minimum wage. So taxpayers they're willing to lock up a huge percentage of the population. 1 in 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 34 are in prison. They're willing to spend more than the minimum wage to keep these guys in prison.
Yeah, right.
In fact, as the next election cycle is coming up, the only way to get in on that ticket on the Republican Party is to promise to lock up more. So more cost. This is never an issue that's ever raised as a way to lower the deficit.
Yeah, they're building more and more prisons.
Yeah.
And what equipment do they use to build the prisons? Oh, Caterpillar. I guess they're available to build prisons, but not bridges.
Maybe that explains their statement that you need more infrastructure. Their infrastructure could be prisons, more prisons.
More slave labor. Well, that's a stock I'm going to have to be buying with both hands. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go up to Canada and speak with Stéphane Molyneux of the freedomainradio.com. Stéphane, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max. Great to be here.
So, Stéphane Molyneux, the U.S. deficit theater of the absurd. They're on the brink of chaos. Every leader of the free world is talking about more debt, the euro ceiling and euro TARP, plus the shenanigans in the U.S. What is going on?
Well, China says, or at least a private Chinese rating agency says, or makes the argument that the U.S. has already defaulted through devaluing of the U.S. against other currencies, and that has been enormous and significant. Just over the past 10 years, the US dollar has lost 40% or more. The Dow, in its real returns since New Year's Day 2000, has lost almost 34%. And so what's happened is a devaluing of the dollar against other currencies. That, as we know, is a result of two things, which are closely related to US debt. The first is keeping interest rates artificially low. And the second is just printing money. And how is the Fed printing money? Well, as we all know, they're aiming to buy or have bought over $2 trillion of U.S. debt, and they've become pretty much the entire holder of the U.S. mortgage industry. And so if you're paying your Visa with your MasterCard, it's pretty clear that you have already shown that you're unable to pay your debt. So the U.S. is functionally in default. It just has these Federal Reserve tricks and shenanigans to prop up the beast a little longer. And so what everybody's talking about are minor tweaks. You know, it's, as they say, arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic long after the iceberg was hit.
Now, you talk about the rise of the debt versus growth, and going back a few decades, the amount of debt that was increased would generate some appreciable growth in GDP. Going back 30 or 35 years, you add $1 of debt, you got $1 worth of GDP growth. And then as the economy began to suffer from over-indebtedness, and as the banks started to crowd their way into the general economy or the real economy, it took $7 or $8 of debt to create $1 of GDP. And then around 2007, 2008, you hit this debt saturation level where no amount of debt creation will ever create another unit of growth, because you can't, put 10 pounds of garbage into a 5-pound garbage bag. They just can't absorb more debt. So this message seems pretty clear. You can't absorb more debt. So why do these policymakers insist on attacking this problem? Like I'm talking to, Paul Krugman of the New York Times famously, his solution is to add more debt. Why do they keep talking about it? It's no more room, no more debt.
Well, look, expecting sane fiscal policy out of the Federal Reserve and state-sponsored and state-supported economists like Paul Krugman is like expecting gambling addicts to suddenly walk away from the table. What is the only solution that the government has when it faces a crisis caused by its own corruption and decadence and thievery? Double down, baby, double down, double down. That's all it can do, is continue to do the same thing. Now, I think it's important to remember that the political class, like the ruling oligarchs, they're fine. I mean, they've got their holdings probably in Swiss francs and gold, and they're all set. They can do whatever they want. It's the average person, and particularly the poor person and the retired person, who is going to face the real calamity when this mess hits the fan. So they're sort of secure. They've got their escape hatch. They've got their golden parachutes. It's everybody else. So they can continue to mess around without any particular fear of their own finances going in the toilet.
All right, you mentioned double down, and immediately got me thinking of the martingale betting system. Are you familiar with the martingale betting system?
I am not.
Okay, the martingale betting system is the gambling system where you go to the roulette wheel and you bet on red. If you lose, you double up. And if you lose again, you double up. And you keep doubling up on every bet until you eventually hit red, and then you make a lot of money. Now, the problem is you can go broke before you hit red. Now, on Wall Street, they engage in this martingale betting system because the money that they get to make the bets is free from the Federal Reserve at 0% interest rate, and they never have to pay off any of their losing bets. Meanwhile, the average person who's in the stock market, anytime they suffer a loss, they actually have to suffer a loss.
Shocking.
So you've got this diametric, opposition in the investing world where people are saying, well, there's a lot of opportunity in the stock market, but it's different if you're on Wall Street and you have unlimited credit and you never suffer a loss. So why do the average people out there, whether it's Canada, America, or anywhere else in Europe, why do they insist on always getting the short end of the stick? Either they get the worst rates on their credit cards, they get the worst gambling percentage in the stock market, they get the worst jobs, they get the worst of everything. Why are they settling for the worst of everything?
Well, I think that most people are very afraid. I mean, this is going to be a long-term historical perspective, but I'll keep it short. Most people are very afraid to change the fundamental social order. And what we're talking about here is a fundamental social order that is much closer to fascism than it is to the free market. You do not have a free market when government controls the currency. You do not have democracy when government controls the currency. What you have is a bribeocracy, where government prints money and steals from the unborn in order to bribe voters for power in the here and now. So the fundamental system has to be gotten rid of. You have to get rid of government control of currency. Currency has to be privatized. That way you can't run deficits. You can't fund these god-awful wars with fiat currency and debt. The whole system is going to change fundamentally. You have to get the government out of currency, and you have to get the government to stop manipulating the market with interest rates. We all know that the reason that the government is driving down interest rates so much is to bribe its friends, to give them basically free loans at the taxpayer's expense, and also to cut down its own costs of having to repay its debt. I mean, if the government had to repay its debt at any kind of reasonable mortgage loan, we'd be in default already. So fundamentally, you have to change the system, and it has to be a very fundamental change in the system. People are very afraid of that. Sometimes it goes the American Revolutionary way. Sometimes it goes the Russian Revolutionary way or the French Revolutionary way. And so people are very scared. They're just going to kind of huddle and hope things blow over and hope things get better, as they have in the past. Remember? Bailed out the savings and loan banks in the 1980s, bailed out long-term capital management in 1998. The bailouts have been going on for a long time. People think, it's going to get better, it's going to get better. This time, it's just not. And until people realize that, they're not going to get off their couches, stop watching TV, take to the streets, take to the blogosphere, confront their neighbors with the falsehoods that they believe. Until people recognize that the system is dead, done, and buried, they're not going to really advocate for change, and it's taking a while for that to sink in for people.
Right. Well, savings and loan crisis was bailed out. Also, 1,500 bankers went to jail. Long-term capital management, not only did no bankers go to jail, but Greenspan lowered interest rates, thus having savers and retirees subsidize the bailout and the yacht payments for a few guys in Greenwich, Connecticut. And when you talk about the stealing from the unborn, of course, my contention's always been that this is why the Tea Party is against abortion. It's because they need new folks to inherit the debts and to go to prison. And let me ask you this. The prison system in America costs $600 billion a year. Is it possible to have a small government in the highest prison population in the world, other than what I just mentioned, that the Tea Party need to justify their religious extremism?
Well, the prison system has become just another handout. It's become just another subsidized industry, which is one of the reasons why you can't get rid of these crazy, ridiculous laws like drug laws and Sarbanes-Oxley and all of these regulations which add up to precisely nothing. I mean, people say, the current crisis was brought about by deregulation, when regulations vastly increased under the two Bush Jr. presidencies. So, no, the prison industry is counted in GDP. Of all the insane things to count in GDP, you count people getting sick in GDP. You count the prison system in GDP. This is complete nonsense. I mean,
it's totally pernicious, because the people in prison are working for 16 cents an hour, but the prison builders and operators are making fabulous wealth on the stock exchange. So they're saying, you see, the economy is growing.
Yeah, because, slave labor is such a positive aspect of capitalist economic growth. Of course you'd want to count that. I mean, the statistics are completely meaningless. We're living in this sort of Pravda house of cards, like the Soviet statistics, the 5-year production plans that are going beautifully. I mean, this is all complete nonsense. We're living in a propaganda delusion, and it's not going to take long for this to come crushing down and for people to wake up. The only danger, Max, and it is a significant danger, which is, I think, why it's so important that we take to the airwaves and yell the truth as much as humanly possible. The great danger is that people are going to think that freedom is the problem. The problem is coercion. The problem is monopoly. The problem is the violent counterfeiting of currency, the selling off of people's future through the coercive power of the state. It is violence that is causing all of these problems. It is not peace. It is not trade. It is not property rights. It is not freedom. And it certainly is not the free market.
All right, now, talking about counterfeiting, the Fed had a little audit thanks to Bernie Sanders, and they revealed $16 trillion in loans that were made to foreign banks and J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, and Jamie Dimon got an exemption as part of this bailout money and loan program to add to his other nefarious activities. Have you been following that $16 trillion bailout figure? And why is America so concerned about bailing out these foreign banks, unless, of course, America reports to foreign entities?
I think America as a whole is pretty clueless about the Fed. It's really complicated, it's pretty abstract, and of course it's the last thing they're going to teach you in government schools. In government schools, they're going to teach you how the government ended slavery, and the government saved us from Nazism and the Great Depression, and the government helps the poor and the sick and the old. You're going to get all that propaganda. You're not going to get the actual basis of government power, which is counterfeiting and theft. So yeah, it's monstrous. And what is truly astounding about this is the way they're handing out these waivers for conflict of interest. CEO J.P. Morgan Chase served on the New York Fed's board of directors at the same time that his bank received almost $400 billion in financial assistance from the Fed. William Dudley, now the New York Fed president, granted a waiver to keep his investments in AIG and General Electric at the same time that they're given bailout funds. And the reason that the Fed gave for not making this guy sell his holdings is because they did not want to create the appearance of a conflict of interest. I mean, so it's okay to have a conflict of interest. You just don't want to create an appearance of it. The Fed outsourced almost all of its operations for these emergency lending programs to private contractors, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, the usual suspects. These guys all got trillions of dollars in Fed loans at near zero interest rates, and 2/3 of these contracts were no-bid contracts. Morgan Stanley got over $100 billion to help manage the Fed bailout of AIG. I mean, it's this complete pig feeding, shark attack, trough feeding at the taxpayer's expense. And it just shows you that the government doesn't have rules. The government is an exemption from rules. It is an exemption from the rule of theft through taxation. It is an exemption of the rule of counterfeiting through the Federal Reserve. And it is an exemption of any reasonable rules of conflict of interest by just handing out, hey, get a waiver, you're fine. It's madness.
All right, one last question. Finally, the latest polls show that Ron Paul could possibly beat Barack Obama in 2012. Is it too late for Ron Paul and his promise to end the Fed, IRS, CIA, foreign military bases, etc.?
Yes. Let me give you a short answer and then a very slightly longer one, which is...
No, I don't think we have time for the longer one.
No, it's very quick. Don't go anywhere near the government. You don't want to be promoted to captain of the Titanic after the ship is just about to go down, because then all anyone will remember is a libertarian was in power when everything went down, and it will discredit freedom for another 1,000 years. So I say steer clear of the mess, stand back, speak the truth, don't get involved.
All right, Stephen Molyneux, thanks so much again for being back on the Keiser Report.
Thanks.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser. I want to thank my guest, Stefan Molyneux. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.